Something strange is happening with the global economy. On the surface, things look surprisingly good, but at the very same time, more and more experts are screaming about a disaster just around the corner. So, what's the real story? Well, today, we're going to dive into a potential crisis that might just be hiding in plain sight. And that's the big question, right? We keep seeing all these headlines about a strong, resilient recovery. But then we also keep hearing this scary term, debt trap. How on earth can both of those things be true at the same time? Let's dig in and figure it out. And this really lays it all out. On one hand, the World Bank is saying the economy is shock-proof. On the other, top economists are warning about a massive debt trap, and they're circling 2026 on the calendar. It's a total head-scratcher, like we're living in two different realities. To get to the bottom of this, we've got to start with the good news, or what looks like good news. All right, first up, this so-called shock-proof surface. Why does it feel like everything's okay? I mean, for a little while there, it really seemed like the global economy could just handle anything thrown at it. And look, if you check the stats from the World Bank, you can see why people are optimistic. You've got steady global growth at 2.7%. Inflation is finally coming down. Interest rates are chilling out. And investors, they're jumping back in. On paper, that all sounds pretty great, doesn't it? And get this, a 10% increase in global GDP per person since before the pandemic. That's huge. I mean, that's one of the strongest bounce backs we've seen in 60 years. But, and this is a big but, who actually got that money? Okay, and this is where the plot thickens. Because when you scratch beneath that shiny surface, well, let's just say the picture gets a lot darker. That good news? It's really only half the story. You know that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats? Well, that is not what happened here. Not even close. What we're actually seeing is something economists are calling the Great Divergence. And it's exactly what it sounds like, a huge, growing split between the haves and the have-nots on a global scale. So remember that big 10% jump we talked about? Well, take a look at this. Over half of that entire gain went straight to the wealthiest countries. So no, this recovery was not shared. It was incredibly concentrated at the very top. And the gap, it is just mind-blowing. Think about it. The average GDP per person in a wealthy country is around $54,000. In a low-income country, it's under $700. And what's really staggering is that 1 in 4 developing countries is poorer today than they were before the pandemic even started. So yeah, some places had a nice short-term bounce, but the long-term trend, it's really, really worrying. The 2020s, this decade we're in right now, is on track to have the worst average growth rate since the 1960s. That's the unsettling reality hiding behind all those optimistic headlines. So, what gives? If the growth isn't real, or at least not for everyone, what's the secret anchor dragging the whole system down? What is the hidden threat here? Well, the villain of our story, if you will, is a massive, colossal pile of public debt. It's been piling up in the background for years, and now it's reached a scale we've literally never seen before. How big are we talking? Almost $100 trillion. To try and wrap your head around that, that's a debt burden almost as big as the entire world economy. It's an all-time record, and yeah, it's a super dangerous place to be. And this is how the trap works. It's something called a debt spiral. It's a nasty, vicious cycle where a government is so deep in debt, it has to borrow more money just to pay the interest on the money it already owes. Once you're in that spiral, getting out is incredibly tough. So how in a world did we get here? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of a perfect storm of 4 big forces. First, you had huge borrowing for the 2008 crash and then COVID. Second, a lot of governments just chronically spend more than they bring in. Third, aging populations mean higher costs for things like pensions and healthcare. And last, all the geopolitical tension in the world pushes up defense spending. And let's be honest, for politicians, borrowing is almost always easier than raising taxes or cutting services. Okay, pay attention, because this is where the clock starts ticking. The whole era of cheap money, with those super low interest rates, that's over. And check this out, a whopping 42% of all this debt has to be refinanced by 2027. That means countries have to get new loans to cover almost half the world's debt, but this time at way, way higher interest rates. That debt spiral we talked about, it's suddenly looking very, very real. I know, $100 trillion sounds like some crazy, abstract number. But this isn't just a headache for economists and bankers. This stuff has a way of hitting all of us, right where we live. So how could this actually affect you? Well, a few ways. For starters, governments in a bind might have to raise your taxes or cut services we all rely on. Think schools, roads, you name it. Second, they might just let inflation run hot to try and shrink their debt, which means everything just keeps getting more expensive for you. And third, all this uncertainty can make financial markets go haywire, which is really bad news for anyone with pension or any savings.
And hey, this isn't just me saying this. Experts like Gerard Lyons are pointing their fingers directly at 2026 as the year things could get really rocky. The warning lights are blinking right now for a crisis that could hit us full force by the end of the decade.
You know, the thing is, we didn't just stumble into this mess. The World Bank is pretty blunt about it. This wasn't just a string of bad luck. This was the result of policy choices and mistakes made over many, many years. And what's really wild is that it didn't have to be this way. If you look back to the 90s and 2000s, a lot of developing countries were actually doing the right thing. They were being fiscally responsible, cutting debt, they were prepared. But somewhere along the way, that discipline just vanished. And by the time the pandemic rolled around, their debts were through the roof.
Which brings us right back to where we started. That whole shock-proof economy, turns out it wasn't built on a solid foundation. It was all propped up by what the World Bank calls hard-to-repeat maneuvers. That's a fancy way of saying governments were just pumping out borrowed money to keep things from falling apart. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. A temporary fix, not a cure.
And I think that's the big takeaway here. At the end of the day, you can't cheat economic gravity forever. There are no shortcuts, no magic tricks. The only real way out of this is to get back to basics. Just plain old, good, sensible economic policy. But that leaves us with one final and pretty uncomfortable question. The solution, fiscal discipline, means making tough choices. It means cutting spending, maybe raising taxes. But in today's world, with promises for more public spending getting louder and louder, do our leaders actually have the political guts to do what's necessary, even if it's unpopular? I guess we're about to find out